Okay, we are live. And as the title says, the subject of this lesson, I guess, is Tzitzit. And the purpose is to do everything. All the sources that deal with Tzitzit, from all the way from Chumash through to the end of Chazal. The reason I'm doing this is because quite a few people who I know of my acquaintance are very interested in this. They have this question, they have that question. It seems to be a thing that comes up a lot. And I thought, just lay down the whole thing and kind of have done with it. So I'm going to go through today. We're going to start with Chumash and Mishnah, then we're going to go through Sifrei, and then we're going to go on to Gemara. And then when we've finished all that, which I think will take about 10 or 11 videos, then we'll deal with a few topics that keep coming up. So one will definitely be how to tie tzitzit and how many strings you should have in your tzitzit. Another one will be, is there a mitzvah to wear tzitzit at night? And another one will be basically what kind of garments are and are not chayim and tzitzit. What kind of garments can you and can you not fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzit? So that's the idea. And apart from just dealing with the tzitzit issue, the other thing I want to achieve with this is to basically show what it's like in practice to review an entire subject from top to bottom. So I once saw brought down the name of the Gra that it's asa for anyone, Rav or not a Rav, it's asa for anyone to give a psak unless he's learned the whole of Shas. Why? Because maybe based upon what he has learned, it appears to him that, this is Musr, or this is asa, or this is Tana, or this is Tal. But if he was to learn, I don't know, the fourth parak of Nazir, he would see that there was something relevant to the issue that he's simply ignorant of, and that would have changed his opinion. So how could you possibly know if you haven't learned the whole of Shas? So unless you've learned the Shas, you should keep stum. Obviously, that's an extreme view. Obviously, in practice, people don't really hold by it, but it's something I think to aspire to, and at least with individual issues, at least with an individual issue, try and keep your opinions back until you've learned everything. And one of the things that you see when you learn in one whole topic, just one, you see how much there is to learn, and then you times that by the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of topics there are, and it should, I think, inspire a lot of reverence and respect for Gedolei Torah, people who are boki in all areas of halacha, just simply what it actually takes to get to that kind of stage. And that's something that people in Makorist circles perhaps aren't always so makpid on. I'm not immune to this tendency myself, and there are reasons for it. But it's the sheer volume of Torah, just how much there is, that's something I kind of want to convey with this. And then the other thing is to just illustrate a particular approach to learning Torah sources. So I call this approach reactionary Judaism, in keeping with Norman Conquest's second, maybe, or third law of politics, which is that anything that is not explicitly conservative, any organization that's not explicitly conservative, will eventually become explicitly progressive. So just to kind of head off that kind of thing at the past, I call it reactionary Judaism, to make clear who's not welcome. And what I mean by it, though, is I mean something very simple, which is using academic sources using an academic approach to learn Torah with the goal of improving your understanding of an observance of Judaism, as opposed to using an academic approach to debunk Judaism or to deconstruct Judaism or to import some kind of foreign agenda into Judaism. And what I mean by an academic approach, I don't mean post-structuralist, semiotic, uja-buja. I mean basically 5 things. One is just caring about whether the Girsa you're learning is correct or not correct, and before you start making diukim, to just be sure that you're not making diukim on a scribal error or a papal censor or whatever. Number 2, I mean having a historical approach to sources, which just means every time you look at a source, you think, when was this source said? Where was this source said? What is the context of this source? Are any of those things relevant? Is it relevant that this source which says X comes from year Y and this source which says A comes from year B? So that's the second part. The third part of what I mean by an academic approach is is not seeing things through a reconciling hermeneutic. What do I mean by reconciling hermeneutic? A reconciling hermeneutic is you have a source that says A and a source that says B, and they seem to contradict each other. And a reconciling hermeneutic says your job as a Torah scholar is to reconcile these two sources. So you might give a strained reading of source B so it agrees with source A, or you might restrict the range of source B so that it covers something different, and therefore it's just saying something different to source A. It doesn't really contradict. And there's no doubt that kind of a reconciling hermeneutic has a big history in Judaism. That's what the Gemara means. That's what the Gemara is essentially doing when it says lav kafshe or hacha b'mayaskinim, or often, not always, but sometimes at least, chisuri nechsera. And that's also what lema tanoi is, which is that if you've got two sources that disagree with each other, it's okay as long as you can fit them into a pre-existing disagreement. And also by Rishonim, this is very much Tosfos's approach. And this is kind of taken to its most extreme version in the Brisker approach, which is that if you find that Rishonim disagree on 8 issues and you can reduce all of these 8 issues to one conceptual issue, that's better because it used to be 8 disagreements, now you only have 1 disagreement. So not looking at things through a reconciling hermeneutic just means not doing that, basically. It means we got source A and source B. First, let's try and understand exactly what source A means. Then we'll try and understand exactly what source B means. And then we'll see what's the difference between them, without taking in advance the idea that you're supposed to be reconciling these sources. The fourth thing I mean by an academic approach is having a kind of excavatory approach to Torah compilations, by which I mean that the Bavli is not one thing. The Bavli is tens of thousands of things. It contains tens of thousands of statements by hundreds of different Amoraim and Tanaim, and also a huge amount of anonymous statements. And an academic approach means, instead of kind of saying, what does the Bavli say, you're trying to understand what all sorts of different sources in the Bavli say and how they go together. And so, a simple example of this is that, an Amora will say X, and then the Stam will say, well, we didn't mean X, he meant Y. And one approach is to say, okay, well, for some reason he said X, but he really meant Y. Another approach is to say, oh, I have 2 things here. I have an Amora who says X, and I have a Stam who says Y. And that in itself is interesting, and to see the process, the progression from one to the other, is interesting. And then the 5th thing I mean by an academic approach is recognizing and appreciating and always being aware of that all the sources you're learning have context that is not contained in the source. And that if you don't know the context, and kol v'chomer, if you are not thinking that there might even be a context, and you think all the information that I need in this source to understand the source is in the source itself, you will often err in understanding that source. And actually, the whole issue of Tzitzit and Techelet is a really great example of that, in that Chazal always talk about a chilazon shel Techelet. And if you know that the word chilazon means snail, then all the other sources that describe this or that aspect of a snail, that it comes up once in 70 years or it lives in this place or whatever, you're filtering through a basic kind of pre-stratum of knowledge that no source ever told you, which is a chilon is a snail. And it doesn't snail as a snail because it assumes you know that a chilon is in a snail. And however, let's say you wanted to rediscover the chilazon and you don't know a chilazon is a snail, and you go through all the sources in the Gemara trying to find this or that remez or this or that hint, what exactly this thing looked like, you're going to go really wrong. And in fact, this happened. And the what's called the Razin Techela is very, very wrong. How do you even kind of start off this search? Well, you go to an Arab, you say, chilazon, what's a chilazon? And he says chilazon, and he says, oh, chazun, or something like that, whatever is Arab word, something like chazun. And you understand that chilazon is a snail. And once you've restricted the range of things you're looking for to a snail, you can then start your search for the specific chilazon that you're looking for. And this is going to be very relevant to all sorts of things we're looking at in Tzitzit, because all the sources assume a lot of knowledge of garments and different type of garments and how garments are worn, which would have been very obvious to the people who these sources were originally intended for. And they're not obvious to you, who lives in a completely different culture, where it's a completely different way of wearing clothes. And what's more, they also weren't obvious even to the Rishonim who were learning these sources, because they also lived in a very different culture, wore very different clothes. All of which is to say, the Torah Sheba'al Peh that's been written down also has its own Torah Sheba'al Peh. As in, even when you write it down, not everything contained in it, not everything you even need to understand what's written is written. That's what I'm saying. Anyway, that's enough kind of rambling. I'm not going to defend or argue in favor of the approach. Kind of what I'm trying to do here is that if you, to show you, by your fruits you shall know, by their fruits you shall know them, to quote a koifer, that if you see it's a good approach, fine. If it just you think it's sterile and it doesn't really illuminate anything, then obviously you shouldn't do it. You should use a different approach. Okay, that's enough general introduction. Now we're gonna move to the sources. My intention had been to share my screen because I made a source sheet on Safaria, but I don't know how to share my screen using this. I'm not even sure that I can share my screen. So hopefully I'll find out for next time. But in the meantime, I'm going to share the source sheet in the chat that I do now have to do. And hopefully anyone following along can follow along with that. And when this video goes out on YouTube, obviously the source sheet will be in the description. Okay, so first we're going to look, as I said, at Chumash. There are two places in Chumash which deal with the issue, the topic of Techelet. The first one is very, very famous. It's the third paragraph of Shema that people say twice a day, or if they're very from, also by Kriyat Shema al Mitzvah, so 3 times a day, sometimes more, because they say Rabbeinu Tam, whatever. The point is people are very, very familiar with this parsha. So I don't need to dwell too much on this parsha, but I do need to just briefly point out a few things that are going to be important. So Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'amat alehem u'asu lahem sisith al kanfei bigdeihem lezoratham. They will make for themselves sisith on the kanfei, on the wings, literally, let's say corners of their garments for their generations. And they put on top of the sisith, that's what it literally says, of the wing corner, a patil. Let's say for the sake of argument, that means string of Techeleth. You will see them and you will remember the mitzvot of Hashem. What we see here, the important points to take from it are there's a concept of asiyah, of making or doing the sisith. They go on something called the kanfot, or the kanafim of, well, not kanafim, kanafim, I guess would have to be the plural here, of a beged. And they have a patil techeleth. That's the important point. And that's what people know. The source that is equally important, certainly no less important, for understanding sisith, which people know much less, is the source in Parshat Kisese, which is one of the many, many mitzvot that dealt with very briefly in Parshat Kisese. So Kaf Bet Yud Bet says, Gedilim ta'aselach al arba kanfoth kasutcha asher techaseh bah. So what does this have in common with Parsha Tzitzit from Bamidbar? And how does it differ? So it has two things clearly in common. One is that it has this concept of asiyah. By the Parsha of Shema, it said, Wa asu lahem, and this says ta'aselach. So there's a concept of making tzitzit, which again is going to be important. Another thing that it has in common is the concept that tzitzit go on here it's kanfot, in a kind of feminine plural form of a beged. That's what they have in common. It also adds something important, which is that has arba kanfot. We're talking about a beged that has 4 of these wings, extremities. And it also adds 2 things that I don't want to say contradict, because it doesn't contradict, but at least kind of require some kind of despite what I said about the reconciling hermeneutic, to require some sort of a reconciliation. So one is that whereas Parsha of Shema talks about Tzitzit, this talks about Gedilin. So we have to understand how Tzitzit can be simultaneously Tzitzit, whatever that means, and Gedilin, whatever that means. That's going to be an important topic. The second thing here is, and this is very, very important, that the Parsha of Shema talked about Begadim, big day. And here it talks about a kasut. A kasut means a covering. Literally your cover that you cover with it. Now, why is this important? Because often when people think about what kind of garment should or should not be wearing tzitzit with, what they're thinking about is the Parsha Shema, and they're thinking about a beged. But actually, within the category of beged, you have something called a kasut, and it's actually this concept of kasut is far more important for defining what is and what isn't chayiv and tzitzit for Chazal. And understanding what a kasut is very important. Hence, I brought here my next source, which is from Shemoth, Parshat Mishpatim, talking about someone who loans something. So first of all, it says you're not allowed to loan at interest, and it says if you take a pledge, an eravon, a collateral, that's fine. However, if you're taking collateral from a very poor person, and so the only thing he has is something in fact he really needs, you can't just keep it, because if his collateral is his garment or his bedspread, it's not reasonable to just make him sleep, in the cold, or to walk around without clothes on, adequately dressed, because you need collateral. So the rule is, as explained by Chazal, if it's something if it's something he needs by night, you can keep it during the day and give it back to him by night. And if it's something he needs by day, you keep it by day, and you keep it by night and you give it back to him for the day. Fine. So it says, if you take as a pledge the salma, another word for garment of your friend, you return him. You have to return it back by evening. Because this is his garment, this is his cover, I should say, alone. He's similar to it's his, another word for garment for his skin, which he will sleep in. And if you don't give it back to him, he will cry out, and I will hear, because I'm merciful to him, not to you. You're in big trouble if you do this. Now, we see here that kasut is used as a synonym on a level of Peshat, as a synonym for simla, and it's described as being something that you sleep in. That's important to bear in mind, okay? And if we look at Rashi, who's quoting from the Chilta, that this illustrates that, but in a slightly different way, which is Rashi, based on the Chilta, I should say, is dashing the pasuk to expand the range of this law. So it doesn't just apply to a salma, or a simla, or a kasut. It applies to basically any kind of garment. So it says. So Rashi says on this pasuk, kaf vav, kihu kasuta zotalit, simlato zechaluk, which is a shirt, b'mei yishkav l'rabotet hamatzah, to include bed sheets, basically. Now, that's not Peshat. However, what is important here is what do Chazal identify here, and this is very important to understanding how all of the sources we're going to learn to do with different kinds of begadim that are and are not chayiv and tzitzit. Kasut means talit. Okay, that's what a kasut is. So when the Torah says al arba kanfoth kasutcha asher techaset ba, it's talking about a talit. Now, what is a talit? What did Chazal mean by the word talit? Talit is obviously not a word from the Torah. Well, you can see that from the Mishnah in Kedushin, Perek Dalid, Halacha Yud Dalid. So it says, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo yira rawak behema, velo yishnu shnei rawakim batalit echad. So the basis of this halacha is that you have to be married. An adult should be married, and he shouldn't wait around for it. As Pirkei Avos said, you should get married at 18. But that's not, as people may assume, a kind of early age. That's a late age. That's to give you time to kind of spend some time learning Mishnah and Gemara, and because you're being brought up as a Talmid Chacham. If you're not doing that, you're just some kind of farmer or whatever who doesn't really learn, then you should probably get married earlier than that, but certainly no later than 18. Why? Because you can't control your Yetzer Hara for conjugal stuff if you're not married. And Rabbi Yehuda is very machmir on this, and he says, therefore, someone who's not married, someone who's a rawak, he can't be a shepherd because things might happen, and he can't sleep in the same talit as another man who is also unmarried. And Chachamim, on these issues, on other issues to do with kind of being secluded in the same place as women, working in a school where mothers might pick up their kids, all these kind of issues, they're also equally strict. They say these things, no, we're worried about, as I read in a book once, I forget which book, you can sin with nature and against it. We're worried that they're going to sin with nature because that's what they have a Yetzer Hara, but we're not worried about people who have kind of messed up, distorted kind of desires, and so we don't need to make such a gezerah. Al kol panim, what do we see? What is a talit? A talit is clearly a bedspread, and so whenever Chazal talk about something or a sheet, not a sheet you lie on, a sheet you lie under. So whenever Chazal talk about a talit, and as we're going to see, they only ever talk about a talit in relation to tzitzit. No other garment name ever comes up. They mean something that's very similar to a bedspread, and that's really very simple to understand. Take your talit, imagine it didn't have tzitzit on it, lay it out on your bed, especially if it's got cool black stripes and whatever. It's a nice bedspread. So this is the kind of garment, a ksut, that we're talking about. Okay, we kind of got onto Mishnah, so we're going to move now on to sources in the Mishnah that deal with tzitzit. But just to review what we learned from Chumash, there's a mitzvah to have tzitzit, but specifically to make them. Both sources talk about lashon asiyah, making or doing. They have to go on the kanfot or the kanafim, which means wings or extremities or perhaps even corners. There have to be 4. They are simultaneously tzitzit and gedilim. And it's the thing you put them on is a beged, and also, and this is more important, a kusut, because basically all forms of kusut are begadim, but not all forms of begadim are kusut. Okay, that deals with sources in Chumash. We are now going to move on and deal with sources from the Mishnah. Now, before that, we should mention that there are 3 big topics in Judaism that are not dealt with in any kind of systematic or detailed way in the Mishnah, and they are tefillin, tzitzit, and Chanukah. And the Rambam in his Hakdama to the Mishnah mentions specifically tefillin and tzitzit, and he explains because these are miswath to midioth that people do all the time, and it wasn't necessary for the Mishnah to talk about them in any great detail because people know that kind of stuff, which is reasonable, although it doesn't explain at all the case of Chanukah, and of various different explanations for Chanukah are brought down. However, a point I want to make here, while we're at this stage, is that actually, of the 3, tzitzit is by far and away the most extreme example of this phenomenon of not really being dealt with in the Mishnah. There are 8 sources in the Mishnah that either mention or, in one case, allude very strongly to Chanukah. I'll list them now, and you can remember them and it could be your party trick, depending on what type of parties you attend. They are, in Masechet Bikurim, it's mentioned as the latest possible time you can bring Bikurim. In Masechet Megillah, it's mentioned in two places, but talking about the same thing, which is it's one of the days you have a special reading of Kriyat Torah in shul. It's mentioned in Moed Katan, which we're actually going to see, because it also discusses Tzitzit, as a question of can you write tefillin on Chol HaMoed. It comes up in Rosh Hashanah that there were 6 months out of the year that the shluchim, the emissaries, would be sent by the Beth Din after they fixed the date of Rosh Chodesh, in order that everyone should know when Rosh Chodesh was, because there was something happening that month that people need to know whether it's this day or that day. And one of them was Kislev. One of those months was Kislev. Why? Because people need to know which day Hanukkah is. And it also comes up in Ta'anith twice. One time it's listed as a day when it's forbidden to call a public fast. And the other case, it's not explicitly mentioned, but it's clear from what it's saying that Hanukkah is a day when you say Hallel. And finally, it's mentioned in Bava Kama, an interesting source where it's dealing with, you've got a camel, and the camel has flax on its back, and flax is extremely flammable, and the flax sets on fire, and then it sets a whole bunch of other stuff on fire, and who has to pay? Who has to pay the damages? So the general rule is that if you leave your flame outside of your shop, then it's your fault, because you should put your flame inside your shop. And if a camel's got every right to kind of go, well, camel and its driver have got every right to go down the street without worrying that some guy just like left a candle in the middle of the street. However, Rabbi Yehuda says on Hanukkah, it's the camel driver's fault. Why? Because you should know that people leave candles outside their shop on Hanukkah. And so therefore, while it's true that the Mishnah doesn't deal with Hanukkah in the same kind of way it deals with all of the other Chagim, with, by the way, the exception of Asereth, of Shavuot, which it hardly deals with, if you only had the Mishnah and you had to just reconstruct what this whole Judaism thing was, you know there was a festival called Hanukkah, you know when it was, you know that it was forbidden to mourn. Oh, I should mention, it's also mentioned in Moed Katan. Sorry, I obviously only mentioned 7. It's mentioned in Moed Katan as a day when certain mourning practices are forbidden. So you know it's forbidden to mourn, you know it's forbidden to have a fast day, you know you're supposed to say Hallel on it, and you know you're supposed to light candles for some reason. So, I mean, that's basically kind of the ABC of what Hanukkah is. And similarly to tefillin, it's not addressed systematically in the Mishnah, but it comes up quite a lot. It comes up twice in Brachot to tell you that women, children, and slaves are exempt, and that an onen, someone whose close first-degree relative has died, is exempt up until the time of burial. It comes up 3 times in Masechet Shabbat to tell you you're not allowed to wear them outside, to tell you that you have to save them from a fire, to tell you that, and also it mentions that the smallest amount of leather that is considered usable is the amount that you would write the Parsha Shema for tefillin. Comes up in the Masechet Shekalim. The person who takes the Shekalim out of the pots is not allowed to wear tefillin because people might worry that he's hidden some tefillin, some money under the straps. It comes up in quite a few places actually, and again, if you had all these sources, you'd kind of vaguely be able to reconstruct what tefillin are based on them. Tzitzit is really the standout example of something that's basically genuinely not there in the Mishnah. And we're now going to look at the sources where it's kind of sort of there, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so the first one is the first perek of Mishnah Brachot, Mishnah Beth, and over there it says, Me'emathai korenes shema b'shaharith, mishayakeh ben techeleth l'lavan. Rabbi Eliezer omer ben techeleth l'charati. When can one say Shema in the morning? Answer, from when you can tell the difference between techeleth and lavan. There's enough natural light, obviously, that you can tell the difference between techeleth, of something that's blue, dark blue, and something that's white. And Rabbi Eliezer says, between something that's techeleth, dark blue, and something that's kati, which is some type of green. Now, as the Gemara in the Bavli points out, if you've got like literally a blue piece of cloth or a blue piece of wool and a white piece of cloth or a white piece of wool, even by the light of the moon, you can tell the difference, unless you're very hard of sight. And also, presumably, this Mishnah is supposed to be giving us some sort of useful siman. Most people don't have like pieces, unless they work in textiles, they don't have just textile examples that they can to hand that they can get out to know whether it's time to say Krishna. Yeah. So, what's the obvious answer? What's it talking about? Why is this a useful siman? Why does everyone have to cheles and levan? Because everyone has to cheles and levan where on their tzitzit. So you take out your talis, you look at the strings, and if you can see the difference between the blue and the white, good. Now you can say Krishna. And that's made very explicit on the Rishami on this, which says Keni Mathnith. We learn over there, or basically we have an expanded version of the Mishnah. Ben Techelet Shabah, Lelavan Shabah. Between the Techelet that is in it and the Lavan that is in it. Now it doesn't say in what, and that's actually where the Bavli leaves it, but the Yerushalmi removes any room for doubt, and it says, Umata Amon de Rabbanan. What's the reason that Rabbanan hold this way? Because they hold Uriithem Otho, you shall see it, Minas Samuchlo. You shall see it, i.e. the Techelet, and note, as the Ramban says on the Pasuk, when it says Uriithem Otho, and Yachid, it's talking about the Techelet. Minas Samuchlo, what's close to the Techelet? The white strings. There you go. Umata Amed Rabbi Eliezer Uriithem Otho, you shall see it. Kadesh Yika Ben HaTzivuin. So it should be visible between the Tzivuin. Now, Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is actually a bit, it's not clear what is this. We know what the blue is now. We know what the white is. What is the green? One possible explanation is we're talking about a green talis, and therefore we're talking about green strings. Or another is that your other garments were green, and therefore you kind of hold up, if I got a green shirt on, I hold up the blue to the green, and can I tell the difference? Al Kol Panim, what do we see from this? Well, the halach we learn from this is a man called Misha Yakir, which is short for Misha Yakir ben Tchilat Elavan. And that is what? Well, if you look on my Zemanim, it will tell you that's the earliest time for talis and tefillin. Now, I mean, that's not really 100% accurate way of putting it. So first of all, as we'll see, it's not clear, and I would argue there isn't an earliest time for talis. There is an earliest time for tefillin, but it's not exactly certain, certainly not from any source in Chazal, that it's this time. What is it the earliest time for? It's the earliest time for Kriyat Shema. That's what it should say. And the poskim, the Rishonim who hold that this is also the earliest time for Tefillin and for Tzitzit, are learning out from Shema because these things are connected. They're learning out. So what it means is if you get up very early in the morning, the best thing to do is to wait until 6 minutes before the sun rises, and say Kriyat Shema just before the sun rises, and then say Tefillah just after the sun rises, which is the earliest time you can daven Shemona Esrei, and then you've put them together. That's called Somech Gula Tefillah. It's known colloquially as davening nets or davening with nets. As my good friend Josh Friedman pointed out to me, you should say davening with hanetz. Why? Because hanetz achama, the hey on the first word is not a definite article that you can just remove. It's one word, hanetz. There's no such word as nets. Hanetz means the kind of sparkling, the shining, the rising of the sun. So you should really say, I'm going to daven hanetz today. But you shouldn't, because people think you're weird. Anyway, what this Mishnah tells us, well, what does it tell us about tzitzit? It doesn't really tell us anything about tzitzit. It tells us that people had tzitzit. It tells us that they've got blue and white. That's basically about it. Okay, second Mishnah, which is from the second parak of the same Masechta, Masechet Brachot, says, Eluhen ben afarakim, ben bracha l'rishona l'shniya, ben shniya l'shma, ben shema l'wahai im shemoa, ben wahai im shemoa l'wayome, ben wayome l'emeth b'yosiv. So the previous Mishnah discussed forms of interruption that are permitted while you're saying the Shema and while you're in the Parakim, which is basically the gaps between the bits of Shema. And the gaps between the bits of Shema are, basically what you would have imagined anyway, which is between the first bracha and the second bracha, between the second bracha and Shema, between Shema and the first paragraph and the second paragraph, etc. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer ben Vayomer le'emeth v'yasiv le'yasiv. No, one of them you've got to cross out. Between the third paragraph and emeth v'yasiv, you should just run straight through. Why? This is what we're looking at here. This is why I brought it. The first paragraph is accepting that Hashem rules the universe. He gets to tell you what to do because it's his world, not yours. And the second one is then once you've accepted it's his world and not yours, and he's the boss and you're the Eved, then you accept his laws. So you can't, I mean, you can, but the point is the proper way of accepting the laws of a sovereign is first to accept they're a sovereign and then to accept whatever they decree on you. Fine. Okay, that explains the order of the first two paragraphs, which is reasonable. But why is Vayomer the third paragraph? Certainly, if it was in the order it is in the Torah, it would be the first paragraph, right? Wahaya im shemo levayomer shewahaya im shemoa noheg bayom uvalayla vayomer enu noheg ela bayom. Wahaya im shemoa is noheg, i.e., is done both by day and by night. Vayomer is only done by day. Now, this is explained differently in the Yerushalmi and the Bavli. The Yerushalmi explains it like what it says, which means when you say Kriyat Shema in the morning, you say 3 paragraphs. When you say Kriyat Shema in the evening, you say 2 paragraphs. You say Shema, Wahaim Shemoa, and then you go on with the brachas. And in fact, the Yerushalmi actually explains, interestingly, that the reason why you have to say 2 brachot in the evening after Shema and only 1 in the morning is to kind of so that it's the same number each time. So in the morning, you have 3 plus 3 is 6. And in the evening, you have 4 plus 2 is 6, right? However, the Bavli explains differently. They say, because of their practice already, certainly by the conclusion of the Bavli, to say all 3 paragraphs both by day and night. They say, no, it's not that Vayomer itself, it's not that the actual paragraph is not said at night. It's that the topic of that paragraph, i.e. what? Tzitzit, is not done at night. Either way, for our purposes here, it amounts to the same thing, which is this Mishnah tells us something about Tzitzit. What does it tell us about Tzitzit? They are not done at night. Now, one thing that's important to note here is that at the time of the Mishnah, and it was preserved in the Yerushalmi, at least it's one of the opinions in the Yerushalmi, you should say Shema mamash when you go to bed. In bed, just before you go to bed. This is why Bet Shammai say you literally should be lying down when you say it. And therefore, we see from this, the least we see from this, you could argue we see more, but the very least we see from this is that you don't say the third paragraph at night. Why not? Because it's not relevant. Well, why not? Presumably because you're not wearing it, which basically means you don't wear tzitzit in bed, or you don't wear tzitzit just before you go to bed. Now, of course, the practice nowadays is not to say tzitzit, it's not to say Shema Mamash before you go to bed. Based on the Bavli, it's to say it even before you daven, which will usually be quite a lot earlier. Even in the Yerushalmi, the opinion is brought down that you can say Shema and then get on with things. Why? Because there were certain the reason given there is because there were certain pious people who used to learn late into the night. And for a start, if they were learning past Chatzot, they can't say Shema and then Mamash go to bed, because you can only say Shema up to Chatzot. At any rate, the minimum we see is you don't wear tzitzit in bed. The maximum, and this is what some people claim from this, is you don't wear tzitzit when it's night full stop. Regardless of what you are currently doing or where you are, or when you plan to go to bed, the sun set, it got dark, you can see 3 stars, boom, there's no such thing as tzitzit anymore. That's one way. And that's the range of opinion you could take out of this Mishnah. Of course, the Mishnah doesn't really tell you very much at all. Number 3. Mishnah in Moed Katan. Now, this is a very important Mishnah for other topics, but as we'll see, as regards Tzitzit, it doesn't tell you a huge amount. And you can't write receipts on Chol HaMoed. Or receipts exactly. So you can't write, you owe me £10. Why? because in those days writing was like a craft. It's harder to write on cloth than it is on paper. It's harder to write with a quill than it is with a pen. It was something that took some time. A lot of people at least couldn't do it, so it was kind of a profession. So you'd have to kind of go to the guy and get him to write it, whatever. And there are a list of things you can write on Chol because they're sufficiently important. But just simply writing, "You owe me £10 for this chicken that I just gave you," that's no good. However, if you don't write the shtachov, which then you can, chas v'shalom, if something bad happens, you can then take to a bet and say, "Look, he owes me 10 quid. He's got to pay up," right? If you can't rely on this, if this man's word is not his bond, okay, you can write a shtachov. Or it's necessary to pay the scribe because the scribe is not going to have any food for Chol HaMoed, then you can do it. Okay, fine. And you're not allowed to write Sifrei Torah or Sifrei Nevi'im or Sifrei Ketuvim or Tefillin or Mezuzot on Chol HaMoed. And you're not allowed to check a letter of the Sefer Torah, even in the Sefer Torah that they would use in the Beit HaMikdash itself, which is either called Sefer Ezra, because it came from Ezra, or it's called Sefer Azara, because it was kept in the Azara, i.e. the temple courtyard. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kosev Adam Tefillin Umezuzot La'asmo, V'Torah Al Yerecho Techileth L'Sisith. All of the above is true, but you can write Tefillin and Mezuzot for yourself. Why? Well, what if your mezuzah got damaged in some way? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to not have a mezuzah or the Chol HaMoed? Well, obviously not. So you've got to be able to write your mezuzah. And of course, this is very important because this almost tells you explicitly. The Yerushalmi tells you really explicitly, but it almost tells you explicitly that you also wear tefillin on Chol HaMoed, because otherwise, why should you be allowed to write tefillin on Chol HaMoed? Just do it after Chol HaMoed. So some people will say bedochet. Well, because you need it the day after Chol HaMoed and it takes too long to write it. All right. I mean, that's possible on the Mishnah. It's not possible when you see the Yerushalmi, but anyway, that's not our topic right now. The other thing you can do, you can spin on your thigh the tzachela that you need for tzitzit. So, when you have wool, you dye the wool, you card the wool, which is combing it basically, and then you take some of this wool and you twist. That's called tivui. You twist it, and you get threads, chutin. And then, as we do, you take, most people tzitzit, you take 8 of those threads that you made by tivui, and you then twist them together, and that's called shizur, and you get like a very thick thing, okay? And you can't do this in the normal kind of mechanical way with a machine that they would do. But if you really need it, because you need tzitzit because you don't have them, fine, you can do it on Chol HaMoed too. I mean, what does this really tell you about tzitzit? It tells you that they have to cheleth on. I mean, we need that anyway, and that's it. Again, not much help if we're trying to answer any of the kind of questions people have about tzitzit. Finally, we have a Mishnah in Minnehuth at the very beginning of the 4th chapter. And the Mishnah deals with things that are and are not ma'akev each other. Ma'akev means, or ma'akev, with a kaf, not a kuf. It's hard to say a kaf properly after an al-ayn, if you say it properly, or at least it's for me. Ma'akev means that the absence of it ruins the whole thing. So, classic example, Arba Minin. If I don't have an ethrog, and I have all the other, I have hadassim, I have aravot, and I have lulav, and I take them and I shake them exactly the right way, halacha, exactly the right time, halal, I haven't done it. I haven't achieved any mitzvah. Pos can bring down that you still should, because to not forget the mitzvah or whatever, but the ethrog or any one of the other 4 species is ma'akev. The absence of it spoils the whole thing. So the Mishnah says, "Hatacheleth ena ma'akevet ethalava, and halavan ena ma'akevet haktacheleth." We'll read one more. Tefillah shel yad ena ma'akevet sharosh, v'sharosh ena ma'akevet shel yad. So both tzitzit and tefillin work like this. You're supposed to have a tefillin shel yad and a tefillin shel rosh. Well, what happens if you only have one? Okay, it's not ma'akiv. You still achieve something by doing it. Okay, that in itself is a complicated subject. We're not going to deal with it. Same way with tzitzit. If you only have white and you don't have any techeles, it's not ma'akiv. It's not ideal for sure, but it's not ma'akiv. What does that mean? It means, well, what people were doing for 1,300 years, roughly, that they were tying their tzitzit without any blue string on it. What does it mean to say if you don't have any white string, it's not ma'akiv the techeles? First of all, I mean, why wouldn't you have any white string? It's not hard to buy white string, especially if we hold that it can white. Well, I say if we hold, I mean, as we're going to see, the Gemara says it in as many words, that it can be literally any color other than techeles. How hard is it to find a string? And the other question is, well, if, as we see, which is the opinion of many Rishonim, and probably correct, you only have one string of techeles, what does it mean that you just tie one string of techeles and that's you kind of achieve some kind of mitzvah? You can go out with it and you can do the mitzvah of Arba Kanfot and you're not over anything and it's not considered an invalid tzitzit. Well, I mean, literally, apparently so. So this Mishnah actually is a tremendous chidush, which is that you have a mitzvah tzitzit that has two parts. You have to make tzitzit and you have to put techelet on the tzitzit. But if you only had one part of them, even though, as the Rambam explains like very explicitly, even though it's still one mitzvah, the absence of part of that mitzvah doesn't ruin the whole thing. So that's it. That's all the Mishnah has to say on the subject of techeles. What of tzitzit? What did we learn? We learned tzitzit has blue and white on it. We learned people wear tzitzit. But we learn that even though tzitzit have blue and white, they don't have to have blue and white. In extremis, in the absence of either blue or white, you can just have blue or white or blue. That's all we learn from the Mishnah. Which is to say, basically, you hardly learn anything from the Mishnah. So, to recap everything we've done, Chumash and Mishnah, where are we holding? Tzitzit have to go on a beged that is a kasuth, an item of clothing that is a cover. A kasuth is a talith. A talith is something similar to a bedspread, either a bedspread itself or something the same basic shape as a bedspread. The techeles has to be a patil. Both the tzitzit and the techeles go on something called a kanaf. There has to be 4 of these kanafos. And the tzitzit, as well as being tzitzit, are gedulim. And there's actually one thing I forgot to mention in its proper place. I apologize, but I'll do it now. The source in Devarim, in Pasha Tzitzit, it says, Gedilim ta'aseh lach al arba' kanfos kesufcha asher techased bah. The pasuk immediately preceding it says, Lo tilbash sha'anez sema ufishtim yachda. You shall not wear sha'anez, wool and linen together. And the fact, we have a principle that things being adjacent to each other in a Torah is not stam. And this is kol v'chomer, by the way, for something like Parshat Kitetse, which is it's like 90-something mitzvahs all in a row. They could be in basically any order. There's no chronological thing or anything like that determining that order. And therefore, HaKadosh Baruch Hu could have placed them in any order. And if you Davka put them together, you put them together for a reason. And so there's some kind of connection between the concept of tzitzit, the mitzvah to wear tzitzit or to wear gedulim, and the issa to wear sha'anez. That's what we learn from Chumash and from Mishnah. The Mishnah basically, as we've seen, adds very, very little, if anything, to that. The main thing it adds is this tremendous chidush that while the Torah says to wear white and techelet, you can, if circumstances necessitate, wear just white or techelet. Okay, so that's it. The next one in this series, hopefully in Mr. Shem, I'm going to do tomorrow, will be on Sifrei. Have a wonderful Rosh Chodesh.